February 17th, 1932, Eagle River, Yukon Territory, Canada. A man is lying face down in the snow, 7 bullet holes, still holding his rifle. It took 48 days, 30 men, 133 dogs, and the first airplane ever used in a Canadian manhunt to put him there. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had their man. They just didn't know who their man was. His pockets had roughly $2,000 in cash, American and Canadian bills, a compass, razor, fish hooks, some nails, a dead squirrel, and a dead bird. He got gold dental work, the kind of dental work you get in Chicago or New York, definitely not the Arctic. No identification, no papers, no name. His fingerprints matched nothing in Canadian or American files. The name he gave when he arrived, Albert Johnson, was almost certainly not his name. Curious. Now, the greatest manhunt in the history of the Canadian North had just ended, and a mystery that hasn't been solved in 93 years just began. Who was this man? Where did he come from? Why did he come to the most remote place in North America? Why did he shoot a Mountie through a closed door without saying a single word? How did one man on snowshoes outrun 30 men in a biplane for 48 days straight in 50 below temperatures? And what did the forensic scientists who dug him up in 2007 actually find? Short answer, we're going to cover it all. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. This is the Mad Trapper of Rat River. What happened on that frozen river in February of 1932 requires us to go back around 7 months. July 9th, 1931. Fort McPherson, Northwest Territories, Canada. A man arrives alone on a raft on the Peel River. He's not on a boat or with a group or a guide, just a dude on a raft alone coming from a direction of Dawson City, and nobody knows who he is. He paddles right past the trading post without stopping, continues upstream against a current, eventually makes it to Fort McPherson. That's 60 miles above the Arctic Circle. He gives his name as Albert Johnson. Now, Fort McPherson is small, it's remote, and everybody who comes through gets noticed, so people notice him. He's about 40 years old, medium height and weight, receding brown hair, pale blue eyes, well-built, and his arms? Witnesses said his arms seemed longer than normal for a man his size. He had a trace of a Scandinavian accent, and he had money. A lot of it for a man showing up alone in the Arctic with almost no outfit. He buys a shotgun and shells from the Northern Trader store, picks up supplies from the Hudson's Bay Post, pays cash, doesn't say where he came from, doesn't say much of anything really. One of the first people to make contact with him was Constable Edgar Millen of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Millen is 30 years old, born in Belfast, Ireland, and joined the RCMP in 1920. He was stationed in Aklavik since 1923, experienced Northern officer and, by all accounts, a good man. He approaches Johnson as a matter of routine. In the far north, the RCMP checked on newcomers not so much out of suspicion, but more out of concern. The Depression was pushing desperate men into the wilderness, and a lot of them weren't prepared for what they were walking into. Millen introduces himself, and Johnson gives him nothing, just cool and quiet, close-lipped about where he'd been and where he's going. Millen notes he seems well supplied with money, notes the Scandinavian accent, notes that he told him he planned to head into the Rat River country, about 20 miles northwest of Fort McPherson, as soon as he got re-outfitted. Now, Millen warns him he'll need a trapping license from either the Arctic Red River or the Aklavik before he sets any traps. Johnson says nothing useful, and the conversation ends. So Millen files a report and moves on. Here's where it gets interesting. Inspector Alexander Eames, the commanding officer of the Western Arctic Subdistrict, reads Millen's report and isn't satisfied. He sends Millen a written reprimand. He wants to know why Johnson wasn't questioned more thoroughly. Curious. What did Eames see in the report that concerned him? What was Millen's read on the man he passed up the chain? Short answer, we don't know exactly, but Eames clearly felt that the cursory contact wasn't enough. And then Johnson disappears into the bush. He builds a cabin on the west bank of the Rat River, 8 feet by 10 feet, small even by northern standards. He builds it alone and doesn't socialize. He doesn't visit trading posts unless he needs something. Neighboring indigenous trappers describe him as queer, meaning a man who apparently disliked the company of anyone. Here's another detail that raises flags. Johnson never bought a trapping license. It's odd for a man who came all the way to the Rat River country to trap, yet he never purchased a trapping license, which either means that he wasn't planning to trap at all or didn't want any record of his presence in any official files anywhere. Curious. Fall turns into winter, November, December, the temperature drops to 40 below and keeps going. The darkness becomes near total, and Albert Johnson stays in that little cabin alone and doesn't bother anybody until December. Now, the indigenous trappers who worked the Rat River were using those lines for generations, and sometime in December of 1931, they started finding their traps interfered with. They were sprung and pulled off the trees that they've been hung on. They go to the RCMP detachment at the Arctic Red River. They file a complaint against their neighbor, Albert Johnson. A later RCMP investigation would find, and this is important, that the situation was more complicated than a simple trapping dispute. The investigation concluded that Johnson had actually confronted the indigenous trappers directly when they came to his cabin, pointed a gun at them, told them to get out. That's not a man who's afraid. It's a man who's made a decision about how he's going to interact with the world around him. And now the RCMP has to go knock on his door. December 26, 1931, Boxing Day. Constable Alfred King and Special Constable Joe Bernard harness the sled dogs before daybreak and mush west from the Arctic Red River. That's 60 miles in Arctic winter. They reach Johnson's cabin on the Rat River. King steps up to the front door and knocks. No answer. He can see the light through the gaps in the cabin. Someone's in there. He identifies himself as RCMP. He's here about the trap complaints. He just wants to talk. No response. King knocks again and calls out. Still nothing. After some time, he and Bernard leave. They've made contact in the sense that they've announced their presence, but without a search warrant, they can't do anything more. So King makes a decision that will change everything. He's going to go get one. He mushes back to the Arctic Red River and reports to Millen. Millen contacts Inspector Eames, and Eames authorizes a search warrant. Now King has to go back, and this time he's not going alone. December 31st, 1931, New Year's Eve, King, Constable, McDowell, and two others make the 60-mile trek back to Johnson's cabin. King steps up to the door, he knocks, and a bullet comes straight through the door into his chest. The bullet misses his heart by an inch, and King goes down. McDowell grabs him, they pull King out of the line of fire, and they get him loaded onto a dog sled. And now they have to make a decision in the middle of the Arctic night with a critically wounded man who's gonna die if they don't move. So they run 80 miles by dog sled to the hospital at Aklavik through a blizzard and temperatures approaching 50 below zero. Constable Alfred King survives, but the RCMP's patience with Albert Johnson is over. So King is alive, barely, and the RCMP now has a very different situation on its hands. This isn't a trapping dispute anymore. A man shot a police officer through a closed door without a single word of warning. That's attempted murder. And in the winter of 1931 in the Canadian Arctic, that means Inspector Alexander Eames is now personally taking charge. Eames assembles a proper posse. Not two men, more, armed, carrying dynamite, and they make the 80-mile trek to Rat River. January 9th, 1932, they surround the cabin. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because what you've probably heard about what happened next isn't exactly what happened. The popular version of the story says that the RCMP dynamited Johnson's cabin, blew the roof off, and Johnson somehow survived a dynamite blast that would have killed anyone else. Proof of his almost supernatural toughness. Now here's what Constable William Carter's 1932 report, sitting in the Canadian Library and Archives, actually says. Inspector Eames himself reflected that the dynamite did practically no damage to the cabin. That's the commanding officer's own words in his own report. What the dynamite did do was give Johnson enough cover noise and confusion to keep the posse occupied for 15 hours in temperatures of around 40 to 50 below zero. Now, all the while, Johnson sat in his cabin and shot at anyone who moved because Albert Johnson prepared for exactly this. And the cabin wasn't just a cabin. He dug a pit in the floor, lined the walls, cut loopholes that he could shoot through without exposing a single inch of himself. From outside in the dark in those temperatures, the posse couldn't get a clean angle on him, so they fought for 15 hours straight. Carl Garland, a civilian volunteer, got a shot off when Johnson briefly exposed himself from behind a circular parapet outside the cabin. Garland believed he probably hit him, but then the RCMP ran into a problem nobody likes to talk about. They ran out of supplies. After 15 hours of a siege and 50 below zero temperatures, they didn't have enough food or supplies to continue. They had no choice but to pull back to Aklavik and resupply. But they weren't going to just leave. They posted a guard, a strong one, and close enough to keep watch on the cabin and make sure Johnson couldn't slip out while they were gone. Inspector Eames made it very clear, Johnson wasn't going anywhere. They were wrong. Sometime during the near-total darkness that is the Arctic winter in January, Albert Johnson walked right past those guards. Not a shot fired, no sound, nobody saw him go, and nobody could say which direction he headed. When Eames returned with fresh food supplies, they marched into what had been Johnson's fortified position and found a substantial food supply. So it looks like he left his food behind, which tells you something. He wasn't running in panic. He packed what he could carry and left what he couldn't and walked out into the dark. He was calm and deliberate, like a man who already decided what came next. And here's the detail the newspaper accounts kept printing that week. The trapper called queer by neighborhood Indians, a man who apparently disliked companionship of any kind, lived alone in the north for several years. It's curious, because this changes the story entirely. This is a man who snapped, not someone bush crazy from Arctic loneliness like some early press coverage has suggested. This is a man who fortified his cabin before the first officer ever knocked. He dug a fighting pit into the floor and cut loopholes in the walls. He planned for a siege and executed his defense of it almost flawlessly. And now he was gone somewhere into the dark, into the bush, and into one of the most inhospitable environments on the surface of the earth. In January, in the dark, in snowshoes. Eames left 4 men behind to continue the search and mushed back to Aklavak to figure out the next move. And somewhere out in those hills of the Rat River country, Albert Johnson was already moving. So now Eames had a real problem here. A man shot a constable through a closed door, survived a siege, and slipped past a guard. Now he's on the loose somewhere in the Rat River Hills with a murder charge hanging over him. This is no longer a law enforcement matter. There's a killer on the loose. The news is on the radio, and the radio in 1932 is everything. This is the first mass media age, and the story of a lone gunman defying the Mounties in the frozen north is exactly the kind of thing that grips a country in the middle of the Depression. People everywhere are tuned in, and the newspapers are printing every dispatch the Canadian press can push out. Add to this, the RCMP had a reputation to protect, and they always get their man. So Eames gets serious. He brings in more officers and more civilian trappers who know the country. He brings in something that's never been used in a Canadian manhunt before, a plane. Wilfred Reed, nicknamed Wap May by the media. May was 44 and a World War I flying ace, one of the most famous bush pilots in Canada. He already knew the North from years of flying mail routes to Aklavak, and he knew the terrain, the weather, and exactly what flying in those conditions meant. May takes his plane and he joins the hunt. Now the posse has eyes in the sky. They locate Johnson's tracks. They find him moving through the hills of the Rat River country headed west, and they close in. January 30th, 1932, Constable Edgar Millen leads a patrol into the thick bush country about 30 miles up from the mouth of the Rat River. They've been tracking Johnson for days, and they're close. They come around the bend, and Johnson's there. What happens next gets reconstructed from the men who survived it. Millen's party comes upon Johnson's position suddenly. Johnson's behind a circular parapet he built in the snow. Carl Garland fires when Johnson briefly exposes himself, believes he hits him. The party holds back for 2 hours, thinking Johnson might be incapacitated or dead. Then they approach from different points, and when they're around 25 yards of the parapet, Johnson fires. Millen goes down, 1 bullet. The rest of the patrol pulls back and drags Millen out of range, but he's gone. He dies shortly thereafter. Constable Edgar Millen, born Belfast, 1901, stationed in the Arctic since 1923, the best pastry cook in the Northland, according to his fellow officers, a man who turned down a promotion because he hated paperwork, was now dead at 30. R.F. Riddle, quartermaster sergeant, leaves immediately for Aklavak carrying the radio report. The news goes out within hours, and it's on every front page in Canada and beyond. Mountie slain by crazed Rat River trapper. That's the headline in the Windsor paper the next morning. And with that headline, everything changes. The public is now fully gripped. The press is calling Johnson the mad hermit of the Arctic, the 2-gun hermit, a demented trapper. The language is getting wilder with every dispatch because nobody can believe that one man is doing this. The RCMP's orders change. Bring him back dead or alive. Eames sends everything he has. The posse's now 8 men strong with civilian trappers and indigenous guides alongside the Mounties. Wap May is flying reconnaissance, spotting Johnson's tracks from the air and signaling the ground party. And Johnson is still moving. Now here's what the press accounts didn't quite convey and what the men on the ground were starting to understand. This man wasn't leaving tracks because he was running in panic. He was leaving tracks deliberately and doubling back on himself. He was using caribou herds to obliterate his trails in the snow, taking ridges where the wind swept the surface hard and his footprints barely showed. He was sticking to high ground where the posse had to cover vast open areas to pick up the trail again. All this in temperatures 50 below. Johnson wasn't just surviving out there. He couldn't build a fire, couldn't hunt, couldn't stop moving for long or he'd freeze. He was running on whatever he packed in that last calm, deliberate moment before he walked out of the cabin into the dark. And somewhere ahead of him was the Alaskan border. If he could reach Alaska, he'd be in American territory, out of RCMP jurisdiction. And given how far the pursuit already stretched, some of the men were starting to wonder if he was going to make it. Eames wasn't wondering. He was already thinking about what came next. So here's what Albert Johnson did next. After killing Millen on January 30th, with a full-armed posse closing in from every direction and a plane in the sky above him, he turned west, and he ran straight into the Richardson Mountains. Now, the Richardson Mountains sit on the border between Northwest Territories and the Yukon. They're not massive by mountain standards, but in February, in the dark, in blizzard, on snowshoes, alone, without fire, you get the picture here. They're a death sentence. Nobody crosses the Richardsons in winter. Nobody. Albert Johnson crossed them anyway. The posse lost his trail completely. Days went by. Eames and his men searched the hills and found nothing. The weather was brutal enough that Wap May couldn't get in the air. Blizzards knocked light snow into powder that swirled 100 feet and made the terrain invisible from above. Some of the men started thinking he was dead up there, that the mountain finished what they couldn't. Then on February 5th, word comes in from a trapper on the Yukon side. He'd seen tracks. Johnson was alive, and he crossed the Richardsons. He was now in Yukon territory, heading northwest along Bell River, parallel to the Alaska border. He was moving fast for a man who'd been running for weeks, without fire and with almost nothing left to eat. Eames immediately reorganizes. He brings in Staff Sergeant Earl Hershey of the Royal Canadian Signal Corps to lead the pursuit party. Hershey is good and experienced. He knows the country, and he's got the right kind of men around him, including a civilian trapper named Noel Verville, who'd been on the hunt since the beginning. May gets back in the air, and the chase resumes on the Yukon side of the mountains. February 17th, 1932, Eagle River. The posse is pushing hard, and Johnson's trail is fresh. Hershey and Verville are out ahead of the main party, moving fast, closing the distance. May is overhead in the plains, circling, watching. Then something happens that Johnson pulled off a dozen times before. He doubles back on his own tracks, coming towards his pursuers instead of away from them. The same trail, the opposite direction. In the snow, it looks like one set of tracks until you're almost on top of each other. Hershey comes around a bend in the Eagle River and meets Johnson coming the other way. The hunted man tries to scramble up the riverbank and get behind the scrub timber. Hershey and Verville grab their rifles, run across the river, and cut him off. They head Johnson off from the timber. Johnson turns and draws first blood. Again. His first shot hits Hershey. One bullet enters the left knee and travels up through the thigh. A second enters the upper left chest between the 7th and 8th ribs. Verville keeps firing. The shots from the rest of the party arriving behind them are now coming in from every single direction. Johnson is in the open on a frozen river with nowhere to go. He does the only thing left to him. He drops into the snow and buries himself almost completely. Just enough of him showing to keep his rifle up. A tiny target in a sea of white. The shots from the posse are splashing snow all around him. It's kicking it into the air, and witnesses could see him squirming from the hits. But he kept firing. Up above, Wap May is circling. He has bombs on board. He's trying to get an angle to drop one near Johnson and finish it, but he can't. The posse's too close. He'd kill his own men, so May circles and watches, and there's nothing else he can do. Then Johnson stops moving. The posse holds and waits. Nobody moves for a long moment. Then they close in. Albert Johnson is dead. The 2-month manhunt is over. May lands on the frozen river. Hershey gets rolled in a blanket and loaded onto the plane. May covers the 125 miles back to Aklavak in 45 minutes and gets Hershey to Dr. Urquhart. Here's a detail from the hospital that didn't make most of the press coverage. In the first days of Hershey's recovery, he kept complaining about a lump in his mattress, something uncomfortable digging into his back. The doctor investigated and found it wasn't the mattress. It was a bullet lodged in his back. The doctor removed it surgically and Hershey recovered. He now had a souvenir from a shootout that nearly killed him. The next day, May flies back out to the Eagle River. He picks up Johnson's body. Round trip takes 4 hours. Inspector Eames is in the plane with him because the body has to be identified, and nobody on Earth knows who it belongs to. So they bring him back to Aklavik, and what happens next in that trading post is something the men who were there never forgot. Johnson's body gets hung in a blubber shed. It's 40 below zero, he freezes solid, and the people of Aklavik come to look at him. The posse members who'd been chasing this man for 48 days, the indigenous trappers whose complaint started the whole thing, traders, trappers, anyone who was anywhere near Aklavik that week, they all came, and every single person who looked at that face said the same thing. Nobody knew him. Not one person in the entire Western Arctic, a place where everybody knew everybody, recognized Albert Johnson. Inspector Eames goes through the body systematically. The pack is shredded from bullets. A tobacco tin punched through, and in the coat pocket, Eames finds a piece of paper. It's Millen's original search warrant. The document King carried to Johnson's door on December 31st. The warrant that authorized the search that King got shot. Johnson was carrying it the entire time. Through the siege, through the mountains, through 48 days of running. He never threw it away. Nobody's ever fully explained why. Curious. The rest of his inventory, $2,425 in American and Canadian bills, a compass, a razor, some fish hooks, a dead bird, dead squirrel, 5 small pearls of low value, also gold dental work in his mouth, the guns. The serial numbers on everything checked immediately against the files, and nothing came back. Nothing matched. Fingerprints taken on the spot are sent to Ottawa. They're sent to Washington. Nothing. The press is going absolutely wild at this point. Reporters from across Canada are trying to get dispatches out of Aklavik any way they can. The Canadian press wire is running multiple stories a day. Papers in Edmonton, Vancouver, Ottawa, Windsor, Calgary, all of them leading with the mad trapper on the front page. And the story they're printing is a mystery. Who was he? Where did he come from? What was he running from? A man in Saskatoon named Lehman steps forward and tells a Vancouver paper he recognized Johnson as a former homesteader from the Empress District of Saskatchewan, where he went north around 1920 and came back with $1,400 in fur money. Now, Lehman is the only person making this claim. Nobody else corroborates it, so it goes nowhere. February 20th, 1932, Dr. J.A. Urquhart, coroner at Aklavik, presides over 2 inquests the same day. One for Constable Millen and one for Albert Johnson. The jury in Millen's inquest found that he was killed while performing his duty by a bullet fired by one known as Albert Johnson. The jury in Johnson's inquest found the following, and I'm going to read you this directly because it's from the official document. The man known as Albert Johnson came to his death from concentrated fire from a party composed of members of the RCMP and others, Johnson having been called upon to surrender by several members of the party and still desperately resisting arrest. Then the jury added this: "We are satisfied that no responsibility rests with any members of the party or the party as a whole. We are further satisfied from the evidence that the party had no other means of effectuating Johnson's capture except by the methods employed. Shooting was the only means of capture." That's the official verdict of the coroner's jury. February 21st, 1932, Johnson gets buried in Aklavik. The man who built his coffin never made one before and never made one again. His son later told filmmaker Michael Jorgensen that he still remembered hearing bones break as the frozen body was forced into the plain wooden box. Millen's body gets flown to Edmonton by Wap May. Over 1,000 people come to pay their respects. King, who started all this by knocking on the door on Boxing Day, is probably still recovering in Aklavik when the news comes through. He'll likely be brought out by May as well. The manhunt is over and the mystery is just getting started, because here's the thing about Albert Johnson. The RCMP ran his fingerprints through every file in Canada. Every file in the United States, no match. His guns had serial numbers, they traced them, they hit dead ends. Nobody in the entire Northwest, in the Yukon, in Alaska, in the Northwest Territories recognized his face. A man came out of nowhere, killed a Mountie, outran 30 men and a plane for 48 days in the most brutal environment in North America, and then died without telling anyone a single thing about who he was. Curious. So the manhunt's over, and the question that's going to define this case for the next 90 years just opened up. Who was Albert Johnson? And I want to take you through this carefully because there have been a lot of theories over the decades, and most of them go nowhere. But the forensic work that's been done on this case is genuinely fascinating, and some of it has never gotten the attention it deserves. So let's start with the first serious attempt to answer the question. Dick North, a writer and researcher based in the Yukon who spent 30 years on this case. 30 years interviewing witnesses across the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, Alaska, Montana, tracking down anyone who had any contact with Johnson or anyone who might have known him. North developed a theory centered on a man named Arthur Nelson. Nelson was a trapper who moved through the Yukon and the Northwest Territories in the late 20s, early 30s, described by witnesses as about 5'9", 175 pounds, light brown hair, pale blue eyes. He carried a 200-pound pack and traveled alone. Highly skilled in the bush, close-lipped and antisocial. Sound familiar? North spent years documenting Nelson sightings and cross-referencing them with the timeline of Albert Johnson's movements. He makes a compelling case circumstantially, but it was never conclusive. Then there was another theory. A man named William Hofner, also known as John Conrad Johnson, is a Norwegian-born criminal with time served at Wyoming State Prison. His photograph existed in prison files. Dick North commissioned a formal facial comparison between that prison photo and the known photo of Albert Johnson taken at Dease Creek. The analysis, called the Sills Report, is included as Appendix F in North's book on the case. The Sills Report charts outlay the hairline, the forehead shape, the nose profile, and the chin line between the two photographs. The similarities are notable, but the facial comparison isn't DNA, and the theory is never proven. There were other names over the years. Owen Albert Johnson, a Norwegian man named Sigvild Pedersen Hagsvold, the subject of a self-published book by a researcher named Fremereld who believed Hagsvold was Johnson. Every single one of these theories had something going for it, and every single one of them eventually was eliminated. Here's how. August 2007. A filmmaker named Michael Jorgensen and his production company Myth Merchant Films obtained permission to do something that's never been done. They exhume Albert Johnson's body from the cemetery in Alklavac. That's 75 years after the man was forced into that plain wooden box with his bones breaking from the cold. The team includes forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Beatty, odontologist Dr. David Sweet, and forensic scientist Dr. Lynn Bell. Now, these are serious people doing serious science, and they find something that rewrites almost everything the press coverage assumed about Albert Johnson in 1932. First, his age. The papers called him about 40 years old. The forensic analysis puts him at approximately 35 at the time of death. He was younger than everyone thought. Second, his back. Everyone assumed the stooped posture witnesses kept describing was from years of hard physical labor in the bush. It wasn't. Turns out it was scoliosis, a spinal deformity that he was born with. It's a condition that would have caused him chronic pain his entire life. Third, his background. The dental work in his mouth was sophisticated and expensive. It's the kind of work that requires access to a major city, a metropolitan center with modern dentistry. So this wasn't a poor man's mouth. It wasn't a man who grew up in poverty or in the wilderness. Fourth, and this is the one that rules out Canada entirely, isotope analysis of his bones and teeth. Isotopes in human remains reflect the environment where a person grew up, specifically the food and the water they consumed during childhood and adolescence. Albert Johnson's isotope profile pointed to two possible origins, the Corn Belt of the United States or Scandinavia. So he wasn't Canadian-born, almost certainly not Canadian-raised. Now the DNA. Samples are taken from the remains and one by one, the named suspects get tested. Arthur Nelson, eliminated. John Conrad Johnson, eliminated. Owen Albert Johnston, eliminated. Sigvild Pedersen Hagsvold, eliminated. I'm sure I said his name wrong. Every name that serious researchers spent decades building cases on is gone, conclusively ruled out by DNA. Dr. David Sweet said, "I'm really disappointed in one way that we weren't able to solve the puzzle. Scientists have an arrogance about being able to throw all of the modern technology at trace evidence and come up with an answer. But it's a forensic reality that some cases remain unsolved." That's the scientists who worked the case telling you exactly what it felt like. But the story doesn't end there. In 2021, a company called Outran, which specializes in forensic genome sequencing for cold cases, takes another run at Johnson's DNA, and they get something. Albert Johnson had Swedish ancestry. Specifically, he descends from a Swedish couple, Gustaf Magsson, born 1776, and Britta Svenstadter, born 1781. That's as far back as the genealogical trail goes right now. but it confirms the Scandinavian connection. It confirms he likely had roots in Sweden or Swedish immigrant community in the United States, which would fit the Corn Belt isotope profile perfectly. A Swedish family immigrated to the American Midwest sometime in the 1800s. A grandson or a great-grandson ends up alone on a raft in the Peel River in 1931 with a Scandinavian accent and a lot of cash and a very strong desire for nobody to know his name. The case is still open. Right now, today, there's an active investigation page on DNAsolves.com. If you think you might share ancestry with Albert Johnson, you could submit your DNA and get it compared against his profile. Nobody's produced a match yet that I could find. 93 years later, a man who shot a Mountie through a closed door without a single word and outran 30 men and a plane for 48 days in the Arctic winter is still protecting his secrets. I'm John Genoa, and you've been watching America's Strangest History. If you know something, reach out. Thanks for watching.